And we're all set.
Thank you, Dave. Good afternoon. This is a reconvening today of the Massachusetts Gaming Commission, a convening of a new meeting, public meeting number 512. I'm Jordan Maynard, and I am serving as interim chair of the Gaming Commission. This meeting is being held virtually using remote collaboration technology, so we'll do a roll call. Good afternoon, Commissioner O'Brien.
Good afternoon. I'm here.
Good afternoon, Commissioner Hill.
Good afternoon. I'm here.
And good afternoon, Commissioner Skinner.
Good afternoon.
It is approximately 1:05. We had some technical difficulties, so I apologize for that. And it is April 3rd, 2024. We're going to start with item number 2. And for that, we will kick it over to Director Monahan of the Investigations and Enforcement Bureau and Licensing Manager Dave McKay.
Yes, hello. Apologies for the technical issues for the last few moments. I can hear you now and hopefully you can hear me. There is a request for a beverage amendment at Encore, and I'm going to turn it right over to Dave McKay, who's taken the lead on this.
Great. Thank you, Caitlin. All right. Good afternoon, Interim Chair Maynard and Commissioners. Before you is a request from Encore Boston Harbor to amend its gaming beverage license to add a new leased outlet venue, Seamark Seafood and Cocktails. This will replace the space formerly held by the Sinatra restaurant. As discussed starting on page 3 of the meeting packet, the application was reviewed by the Division of Licensing. The scope of the review also included verification pertaining to the licensed area manager for Encore Boston Harbor, Chelsea Brewster, to ensure that she held a valid certification from a recognized alcoholic beverage server training program and is properly licensed by the commission, and also that the designee for the jointly responsible person, Seamark, Ricardo Soto, also holds a valid certification from a recognized alcoholic beverage server training program and is properly licensed by the commission and is in good standing. Furthermore, an on-site inspection was performed by Louis Lozano, IEB Casino Regulatory Manager, and as you saw before, Burt Kane, Division Chief of the Gaming Agents, is on the call in case you have any questions regarding that. But that inspection confirms the accuracy of the reported licensed area information. Additionally, this inspection also confirmed the licensed area's surveillance and security were in compliance and provided adequate coverage. I did want to pause at this moment to address one point of a clarification. Commissioner Skinner posed a question in regard to the language on application page 3 under the jointly responsible person box, which states attach evidence that the licensee maintains authority over the jointly responsible person. And I also wanted to note that the Division of Licensing has obtained a copy of the lease agreement between Encore and Seamark. And additionally, just revisiting the licensed area information, as previously noted, Chelsea Brewster acts as the licensed area manager responsible for the outlet on behalf of Encore Boston Harbor, while Seamark has appointed their own designee, Ricardo Soto, as the jointly responsible person. Lastly, I did want to note the Division of Licensing worked with Juliana Catanzariti and Jackie Crum on behalf of Encore in relation to this request. And we are recommending that the commission approve this request. And at this time, I'm happy to try and answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Dave. Fellow commissioners, do we have any other questions? And thank you, Commissioner Skinner, for raising that question. I don't see any. Burke, I'm just going to ask, are you all good? Oh, wait, Commissioner O'Brien.
No, go ahead. I was just going to comment on how much I like the Chelsea Brewster name. I was literally thinking it was a company picking seaside locations. So what a great name.
It is a great name. Burke, are you good with everything?
Yes, last week, Lewis and I were able to walk through the CCTV cameras meet what we want, and the security of the alcohol in the bars are in function with what they represented, and we inspected it, and was proven to be so.
Great. Well, with that said, and seeing no other, Commissioner Hill,
Mr. Chairman, I move that the commission approve the amendment to Encore Boston Harbor's beverage license as included in the commissioner's packet and discussed here today.
Second.
okay, we have a motion from Commissioner Hill, a second from Commissioner O'Brien. Commissioner O'Brien,
Aye.
Commissioner Hill,
Aye.
Commissioner Skinner,
Aye.
and I'm a yes. That's 4-0. Congratulations and good luck to Encore Boston Harbor and to Seamark Seafoods and Cocktails. And thank you to the IEB and the licensing team. We appreciate your diligence and great work on this. So next item.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dave. Next item, we're going to kick it over to Director of Research and Responsible Gaming, Mark Vanderlinden, and Dr. Rachel Volberg for the presentation of the Gambling and Problem Gambling in Massachusetts results of a follow-up population survey. I do want to say a couple things, though. Dr. Volberg is well known and respected by all of us here at the Gaming Commission. But for the benefit of the public, Dr. Volberg is a research professor at the School of Public Health and Health Sciences at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She has been involved in research on gambling and problem gambling since 1985. She has been recognized by the National Institutes of Health to study the prevalence of problem gambling and has been a principal investigator on the MGC's Sigma study. She has been published extensively, and we cannot say it enough. We are fortunate to have her expertise and experience here in the Commonwealth. I believe that the commissioners have received the study Dr. Volberg will be discussing here today. I want to take the time to say that we were lucky in the first place to have a baseline study, and we're even more lucky to have a follow-up. It presents the commission with a great opportunity to build policies and regulations based on research and hard data. Our GameSense program, our play management tools, and our ongoing studies, including those related to how we will use AI, how we will promote safe and healthy marketing and player acquisitions, and many other initiatives, will be shaped by this study. The MGC will continue to meet the patrons where they are, especially those who are most vulnerable, and we will continue to educate and promote our programs to help those who need it most. I get approached by many outside of the building who call it the Massachusetts model or the Massachusetts miracle. But what matters most to us is that we continue to research, study, and help those who game, so they can do so in a healthy and sustainable way. I do have one question for my fellow commissioners. Do we want to ask questions as we go, or do we want to save them to the end? Commissioner O'Brien?
I think in general, we save it to the end unless there's something organic that would really require a dive into a particular slide. It makes sense to keep doing it like we've been doing it.
Sounds good. Just flag it for me if something comes up, because if we have something on the screen. With that said, Director Vanderlinden and Dr. Volberg.
Great. Thank you for that great introduction, Chairman Maynard. Good afternoon, commissioners, and welcome to our new Executive Director, Dean Serpa. I am more than pleased to be here today with Dr. Rachel Volberg. Before I turn it over to Dr. Volberg, if I could just do a quick introduction. So included in the 2011 Expanded Gaming Act is a requirement that the Massachusetts Gaming Commission establish an annual research agenda. This included a baseline study of problem gambling and the existing prevention and treatment programs that address its harmful consequences. To fulfill this requirement, the MGC, in March of 2013, the MGC selected a research team from the University of Massachusetts Amherst School of Public Health and Health Sciences to implement a comprehensive research agenda that included a baseline study of problem gambling. Shortly thereafter, and before any casinos opened in the state, the UMass team fielded a survey and released that baseline report. Now, roughly 10 years later, the same team of researchers were tapped by the MGC to carry out a follow-up general population survey. The main purpose of this study is to determine whether and how gambling attitudes, gambling behavior, and problem gambling prevalence changed in Massachusetts following the introduction of 3 casinos. Results from the follow-up general population survey are directly comparable to those that were found in 2013 and 2014 in the baseline survey. In addition to these overall assessments, the report addresses the question of whether the demographic and behavioral patterns of gambling and problem gambling prevalence changed in Massachusetts between 2013 and 2021. As Chair Maynard said, we are really lucky. Dr. Volberg was the principal investigator for that 2013 study and again for this follow-up general population survey. So, and I've had the pleasure of working with her that entire time. And I can speak to her credentials and her overall just excellent work in this space. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Volberg.
Well, thank you. I guess I'm blushing and feeling like I'm ready to retire now. At any rate, greetings, commissioners and Interim Chairman Maynard. It really is a pleasure to be here today to present the results from this important survey. I know we've been waiting a long time for this, so let's just get right into it. I emailed Mark earlier about 15 minutes ago to tell him I was having some minor technical difficulties. So Mark, are you going to be able to show my slides? All right. So let's move to the next slide, please. Yep. So this slide just presents an overview of what I'm going to be talking about today. We're going to focus first briefly on the methods that we used for the survey, which were very similar to the methods we used for the baseline survey in 2013 and 2014. And then I'm going to walk through the major findings from each of the major sections of the survey, including attitudes, gambling behavior, problem gambling prevalence, and then comparing recreational, at-risk, and problem gamblers, discuss a little bit about what we found about awareness of problem gambling services in Massachusetts, discuss changes that we identified since 2013, and then touch on some future directions. Next slide. So this slide and the next one presents some information about how the survey was conducted. As I've mentioned, it was aligned very closely with the baseline survey questionnaire. We wanted to be able to do as much comparison as possible. We did add some items based on what we had learned in the interim since the baseline survey. We added some items assessing sports betting in a good bit more detail. We were interested in finding out more about non-gambling spending at the casinos. And of course, given the timing of the survey, we were interested in what the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic might be on behavior. Just to sort of frame this, this was not introduced to people as a survey of gambling very purposefully so that we did not over-recruit gamblers and under-recruit people who were either not involved with or not interested in gambling. We described the survey to them as a survey of health and recreation. And we started off the questionnaire with questions about physical and mental health and preferred types of recreation to make that a real thing. We asked about alcohol and drug use, and then we moved into assessing attitudes toward gambling, gambling behavior and problems, and questions about services. We did a random sampling of households and individuals in households, and we had targets set for particular groups that we knew from the baseline were harder to recruit into surveys generally. That included Asians, African Americans, Hispanics, and young adults. Particularly those aged 18 to 20. They just don't seem to like to talk to people who are doing surveys. Next slide. So this is where people may not realize how dogged we were in our efforts to recruit people into this survey. We started with an invitation letter to randomly selected households. There was a small $1 incentive in each of the envelopes that we sent out. That was followed a week later by a reminder postcard. I'm sorry, 2 weeks later by a reminder postcard, 2 weeks later by another letter with the self-administered questionnaire included. 2 weeks later, a reminder postcard, and then followed by another letter with a self-administered questionnaire. And then our final push was to recruit people by telephone if they hadn't responded in the previous 2 modes. And you can see that the majority of people completed the survey online. About a quarter of our respondents completed the self-administered questionnaire, and a little under 2% completed by telephone. We were very pleased with the proportion of respondents who completed the survey in Spanish. It was much higher than what we had had in the baseline. And the weighted response rate was 27.5%, which in the olden days when I first started doing survey research would have been kind of disappointing, but in the current day and age, that was actually pretty respectable. And then once we had all of the data in hand, we conducted a number of statistical methods to align the sample with the Massachusetts adult population. And the weighting included the variables that you see: gender, age, ethnicity, and education. Next slide. So now on to some results. The first topic area that I want to talk about is concerns attitudes towards gambling amongst Massachusetts adults. And the slide that you're looking at presents responses to a question about the overall availability of gambling in Massachusetts. It shows that the clear majority of Massachusetts adults in 2021 and 2022 believed that the availability of gambling in Massachusetts was too high. This was a significant change compared to the baseline survey before any casinos had become operational. So it's likely, in our view, that this change reflects both the introduction of casinos in Massachusetts and the impending introduction of legalized sports betting, because the survey was carried out sort of in the midst of the work to pass legislation on that issue in Massachusetts. There were some demographic differences related to beliefs in the availability about gambling in Massachusetts. Groups that believed, or more likely to believe, that gambling was too widely available included women, adults aged 18 to 20, Asians, and retired adults. While those who were more likely to believe that the current availability was fine included adults aged 25 to 54, whites, Hispanics, and people who were employed. Finally, those most likely to believe that gambling was not available enough included people with less than a high school education and people with incomes under $30,000. Next. So this slide presents responses to a question about the overall benefits and harms of casino gambling, specifically in Massachusetts. And it shows that there has been quite a significant change in the proportion of adults in Massachusetts who viewed the benefits and harms of casino gambling as about equal. Nearly half of Massachusetts adults viewed the benefits and harms as about equal, compared to only 19% prior to the introduction of casinos in the state. And it's worth noting, I think, that responses to this question in the baseline survey were based on people's expectations, whereas the responses in the follow-up survey were based on people's actual observations and experiences. So again, there were differences in beliefs about the benefits and harms of casino gambling based on demographics. Men were more likely than women to see casino expansion as beneficial. Asians were more likely than whites, Hispanics, or Blacks to see casino expansion as harmful. Education was associated with attitudes, with those with some college or with college degrees most likely to see casinos as beneficial. Employed people, retired people, and disabled individuals were more likely to see casino gambling as beneficial compared to people who were students. But there were no differences in views about the impact of casinos in relation to age or household income. Next slide. So one of the things that we did in developing the report that you have before you is we developed a number of hypotheses based on what's known in the research literature and sort of the expertise within the team. And so periodically through this presentation, you'll see some of the results of our testing of those hypotheses. And the first hypothesis had to do with attitudes. We hypothesized that attitudes toward gambling would be less negative in the follow-up survey compared with the baseline, reflecting Massachusetts adults' experience with the actuality of casino gambling in the Commonwealth. However, this hypothesis was not supported because a significantly greater proportion of Massachusetts adults believed that the current availability of gambling in the state was too high in 2021 compared to 2013. There was, however, a noticeable shift towards the center in views about the harms and benefits of gambling, with fewer people viewing expanded gambling as beneficial, but also fewer people viewing expanded gambling as harmful. So moving on, we're now going to talk about gambling participation. Next slide. For consistency, we provided all of our respondents with a definition of what we meant by gambling, and I've provided that for you here. We actually assessed 13 different activities in the gambling section of the questionnaire. And for each of those activities, we assessed past year participation, frequency of participation in the past year, and expenditures on that type of gambling in a particular month. I want to just specify, I won't read through the list of 13 different activities, but it included sports betting, as well as online gambling and lottery and casino and the usual activities that we assessed for. The next slide is a presentation or a comparison rather of past year participation rates overall and for each of the different types of gambling in the baseline on the left-hand side and in the follow-up survey on the right side. And so what you can see is that past year participation among Massachusetts adults declined significantly for the majority of the gambling activities that we assessed. The only types of gambling where past year participation did not decline significantly were daily lottery games, that's the Keno or monitor game, and online gambling. The declines in past year purchases of instant lottery tickets and traditional lottery tickets, as well as participation in casino gambling, horse racing, and sports betting, all ranged in about the 25% decline. Next. So these were our next two hypotheses, which had to do with gambling behavior. And I will say that we did not take the pandemic into account when we generated these hypotheses, but we anticipated that participation in casino gambling would be higher in the follow-up survey compared with the baseline, reflecting the impact of the introduction of casinos and the expansion of that type of gambling in Massachusetts. However, that hypothesis was not supported because past year participation in casino gambling declined significantly between the two surveys. For much the same reason, we hypothesized that participation in lottery games would be lower in 2021 than 2013, potentially reflecting shifts in gambling participation and expenditures from lottery to casinos. That's a cannibalization or substitution is a very major concern when you think about sort of the full suite of gambling activities. Because participation in traditional large jackpot lottery games and instant scratch tickets was lower compared with in 2021, in 2021 compared with 2013, this hypothesis was partly supported, but as you'll see in the next slide, we had a major unanticipated event. Every scientist's nightmare is something unpredictable that comes in sideways on your experiment. And the pandemic came in sideways on everybody's life with major impacts. But we realized as we were finalizing the questionnaire for the follow-up survey that we needed to include some questions about COVID to assess this specific issue. So we did a number of things. We considered the timing of the restrictions in Massachusetts and the past 12-month recall window because that fielding in 2021, we did that for a number of very solid scientific reasons, but we knew that people's responses could be affected by the recency of the pandemic. We looked more broadly at the correlation of changes in the general population surveys, both the baseline and follow-up, with changes in our concurrent online panel surveys to see if the behaviors were moving in similar directions. And then, as I mentioned, we had specific questions that we added about the impact of COVID-19 on gambling behavior. And what we found was that indeed, the pandemic and the associated restrictions almost certainly had an impact on prevalence rates of gambling participation in the follow-up survey. We believe, however, that this affected the behavior of recreational gamblers to a much greater extent than those experiencing gambling problems, simply because it's more difficult for people who are heavily engaged in gambling to change their behavior in contrast to folks who are less engaged, who are more likely to find it easier to stop gambling or to reduce their gambling as they sort of dealt with shutdown conditions and restrictions that followed the closure of the casinos for quite some time. Next. So this next section addresses the issue that is always the elephant in the room whenever we're talking about gambling surveys. Everyone wants to know what's going to happen with problem gambling. That is the major negative impact that people consider when they think about gambling. So this slide just presents the classification criteria that we use. It's a validated instrument to assess gambling problems in population surveys.
Dr. Goldberg, we
Yes.
are having just a slight technical difficulty. We get you most of the time, but there was a little break there. If you could start over. I think the last part we caught was this is the most important part that people like to look at and get a hold of.
Okay, sorry about that. As I told Mark, we're having major heavy rain out here, and so I think the the climate is affecting my presentation. Sorry. So this slide here is just the criteria that we use for classifying people in the survey as non-gamblers, recreational gamblers, at-risk, problem, and pathological or disordered gamblers. In the interest of time, I had been chatting along about how this works in relation to clinical criteria, but I think I'll move right along and ask Mark to show the next slide. So this is what we found in the follow-up population survey. And based on a adult population in Massachusetts in 2021 of 5.4 million, we estimate that somewhere between 54,000 and 114,000 Massachusetts adults were problem gamblers in 2021. An additional 400 to 530,000 Massachusetts adults were at-risk gamblers. And communities, the proportion of the Massachusetts population affected by gambling-related problems that we have here is actually pretty conservative. And now the next slide. So this was our fourth and perhaps most important hypothesis. We hypothesized that problem gambling would be higher in 2021 compared to 2013, reflecting the increase in gambling availability. However, this hypothesis was not supported as the prevalence of problem gambling did not change significantly between the two surveys, as you can see. So instead, we saw an increase in the proportion of non-gamblers in the Massachusetts population and a decrease in the proportion of recreational gamblers, rather than any changes in the higher risk groups. So a separate consideration concerns how the prevalence rate in Massachusetts in 2021 compares to other states. And we have developed a methodology to allow for standardization of problem gambling prevalence rates to let us compare Massachusetts or another jurisdiction with many other jurisdictions. And I will say that the prevalence rate in Massachusetts of problem gambling in 2021 was mid-range between 2.8% in New Jersey in a couple of years earlier, and a 0.7 rate in New York, which was actually anomalously low because that survey was conducted in 2020 in the middle of the pandemic. Next slide. So now I want to focus a little bit on sports betting. As you are all aware, I'm sure, the Sports Wagering Act requires the Commission to conduct research to answer 4 specific questions. And we are focused here on the first question, which is whether sports bettors are different than individuals participating in other forms of gambling. So we analyzed our data to investigate whether people participating in sports betting in Massachusetts differ from individuals participating in other types of gambling. And what we found was that sports bettors do differ from individuals participating in other sports types of gambling. We found significant differences in the demographic characteristics of sports bettors compared to those who gambled but not on sports in the past year, and much higher rates of participation among sports bettors. And the next 2 slides demonstrate that. So this is focused on demographics and shows that sports bettors in Massachusetts were more likely than non-sports betting gamblers to be male, under the age of 35, white, to have a bachelor's degree or higher, and to be employed. And overall, I would say that Massachusetts sports bettors, at least in 2021, were very similar to sports bettors in other jurisdictions. That is, more likely to be male, young, well-educated, and either employed or attending school full-time. The next slide, yes, the next slide compares past year participation rates for all of Massachusetts adults and compared to sports bettors, and shows pretty clearly that sports bettors are much heavier gamblers than Massachusetts adults in general. So, for example, when it comes to the traditional lottery, 62% of sports bettors had purchased a lottery ticket in the past year, compared to 43% of Massachusetts adults. And on down the line, so some of the biggest differences were gambling at a casino, private wagering, and then betting online. Finally, moving into our comparison of gambling groups. Oops, can you go back a little bit, Mark? Do we have, no, okay. And then there should be comparing gambling groups. Thank you. I'm not going to spend too much time on this. This was comparing problem, at-risk, and recreational gamblers along a number of different demographic characteristics. So the top left is gender, then you have race, ethnicity, and education, and then income. And so you can see that, for example, problem gamblers and at-risk gamblers in Massachusetts in 2021 were more likely to be male rather than female. They were less likely to be white. They were less likely to have attended college or to have graduated from college, and they were more likely to have lower incomes. And the next slide, again, is comparing gambling participation among those three groups: recreational, at-risk, and problem gamblers. And what we see based on this table is that
Rachel, hold on,
Yep.
just 1 second. Just let it catch up. It was kind of garbled there for a second. I think it's the weather thing. So maybe try starting again. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so this slide just shows that there are some significant differences in the types of gambling that different groups of gamblers have engaged in the past year. You know, we use recreational gamblers as our main comparison group because that's the largest group, so that's what most people do. But at-risk gamblers were more likely to have played lottery games, to have gambled on casino table games and slot machines, to have bet on sports, wagered privately, bet on horse races and bingo, and gambled online. Problem gamblers were more likely than recreational gamblers to have played lottery games and gambled on casino table games as well as slot machines. Yeah, so the demographics and the gambling participation of these groups is important and interesting, mostly from the perspective of targeting resources in terms of prevention. So rather than spend any more time on that, if we can move along. So one of the things that I have always found interesting and probably taken the most flack from in terms of my academic career is estimating expenditures on problem gambling or expenditures on gambling by different groups of gamblers. So what this slide shows is that in total, at-risk and problem gamblers spend much more on gambling annually than recreational gamblers. It's interesting to compare the proportion of expenditures shown in this figure with the proportion of each of these groups in the sample. So although recreational gamblers constituted 51% of our sample, they accounted for only 12% of the reported expenditures. And the disparity is even more noticeable for at-risk and problem gamblers. So as a reminder, at-risk gamblers constituted 8.5% of the sample, but they accounted for 68% of the reported expenditures on gambling in the past year. Problem gamblers constituted 1.4% of the sample, but accounted for 20% of the expenditures. And then the next slide, I feel is also an important point of information for the Gaming Commission and for the general public to consider. In the baseline report, we argued that the proportion of expenditures accounted for by different gambling groups should be monitored to see if and how this changed in the wake of expanded gambling. And what this slide shows is that in 2013, recreational gamblers accounted for 26% of self-reported expenditures, at-risk gamblers accounted for 51%, and problem gamblers accounted for 23% of self-reported expenditures on gambling. In 2021, as you can see, recreational gamblers accounted for a much smaller proportion of self-reported expenditures, and at-risk gamblers accounted for a much larger proportion of self-reported expenditures compared with 2013. So while both of these results conform to what's called the Pareto principle, where 20% of outcomes, whether it's occupational health and safety or engineering, quality control, health, businesses, 80% of outcomes are generally accounted for by 20% or less of the individuals involved. This change in, particularly in the at-risk expenditures is a concern, and I think we'll want to figure out some good prevention messages to be able to address that particular issue going forward. Just a couple of slides now on differences across these groups in terms of health. Recreational gamblers were more likely in 2021 than in 2013 to identify their physical health status as poor or fair, and to say that they had experienced serious problems with depression or anxiety or other mental health problems in the past 30 days and in the past 30 years. The differences were not statistically significant. The differences between at-risk and problem gamblers were not statistically different, but it's possible that some of the responses to these questions may have had more to do with experiencing the pandemic than they had with the introduction of casino gambling in Massachusetts. The next slide shows comparisons for tobacco use, binge drinking, and illicit drug use. And you can see that recreational gamblers in 2021 were actually less likely than recreational gamblers in 2013 to have used tobacco and to have binged on alcohol in the past 30 days, but more likely to have used illicit drugs. And then in terms of problem gamblers, they were less likely in 2021 than in 2013 to have binged on alcohol in the past 30 days. And there were no significant differences in any of these behaviors among at-risk gamblers in 2021 compared with 2013. And then finally, we turn to awareness of services. So everyone in the survey, all of the respondents were asked if they had seen or heard any media campaigns to prevent gambling problems in Massachusetts in the past year. And it is definitely a concern that awareness of problem gambling prevention efforts is lower in 2021 than in 2013, since there are now, and were in 2021, substantially more gambling opportunities in Massachusetts. And we had actually anticipated that awareness would be higher. So I just want to add that though we had questions about wanting and seeking help for gambling problems in the survey, the number of individuals endorsing either of those questions was actually too small to report. But we do have some recent survey data from Connecticut that provides some useful data points. In Connecticut, where we conducted a survey in 2023, 25% of Connecticut's respondents classified as problem gamblers had wanted help for gambling problem in the past year. 21% had sought help, but the majority preferred to try to curb their gambling on their own. And those who did seek help in Connecticut most often accessed sources other than the state-funded treatment services. So I think that information could be taken on board in Massachusetts, even though we are in a different state, we are right next door.
Dr. Volberg, I'm sorry, this is Commissioner O'Brien.
Yes.
Do you know
Yes.
what were those non-state offered? Do you have any sense of what those services were?
My recollection, because I haven't looked at the Connecticut data in a few months, my recollection is that the most often accessed resources were actually Gamblers Anonymous and friends and family. So people seeking help from their friends and family to, like give them their credit cards or help them manage their money somehow. Make sure that they didn't take their debit card with them when they went to gamble. There's a lot of things that people try to do on their own before they're willing to sort of say, well, I need some outside help. And that's not, that's actually not even specific to gambling. There's a lot of sort of, personal issues that people experience where the first thing they want to do is see if they can take care of it themselves, or just, with informal help.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I have a quick question as well. I just want to be clear, Dr. Volberg. When I see everyone was asked if they had seen or heard any media campaigns over the last year, are we talking from 2024 to 2023, or are we still in 2021? Because I'm finding it hard to understand how it could have dropped 50% when all I see on TV are now ads trying to help people get help and give out numbers. So when was this actually done?
The survey was conducted from September of 2021 through April of 2022.
So when I see this, it says within the past year, this is the survey we're talking about, not from,
yes,
not from 4324 to 432023. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's correct.
Yep, I just wanted to be clear about that. That makes me understand this a little bit better, because it was over the last year that we started seeing those commercials and PSAs and things of that sort. Thank you.
And if I can just put a plug in for some additional research that we're going to be presenting to you later in the year, we do have a different kind of survey that we've been fielding more recently, and that actually has some additional information about awareness of services that we will be able to share that probably in the next 6 months.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Hill and Commissioner O'Brien. And actually on this particular slide, they've now I can now ask my question because they did too. Doesn't this present, understanding that some of the data may be lagging, doesn't this present a real opportunity to the commission to push out these great services, to get more, put more light on it, and perhaps make sure that, you know, people know, right? We want to meet them where they are. You know, people know these things exist.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, there's always an opportunity when you see something like this where, you know, data have gone in a direction that you think is opposite to what you either expected or what you would like. It's an opportunity to think about concentrating resources in a targeted way. You know, and the fact that there is quite a lot of stigma around gambling problems. You know, people have great shame about not being able to manage their money. But there's also quite a lack of awareness about where to find help. You know, people think that they need to have insurance coverage to get that help. Those are all messages that can be pushed out there, and I think should be pushed out there. And, you know, and to also to sort of, you know, echo the National Council's old helpline, you know, or tagline of, you know, where there's hope, there's help. You know, that treatment can be effective if you seek it out, and that it is available in Massachusetts.
Thank you.
So on the next slide, I just want to direct your attention down to the bottom here, where we do have some more current information on numbers of calls to the helpline in Massachusetts in fiscal year 22 and unique website visitors. And my takeaway from this is that clearly the helpline, the phone calls are not where the bulk of the help seeking is happening. The magnitude of the number of unique website visitors is pretty impressive. And it suggests that that may be where people are, at least initially, starting the process of looking for help to address a gambling problem, is to go on the website and, you know, look for maybe for self-help materials or online resources. So that 56,000 number was actually a good and pleasant surprise. So next slide. So just to identify pretty specifically what the changes were that we felt were most important since the baseline survey in 2013, there has been an increase in the view that gambling is too widely available. And this was prior to the legalization and operationalization of sports betting. Gambling participation has declined for most types of gambling in Massachusetts since 2013. We think at least partly due to the lingering effects of the pandemic, but there has been a much longer trend of decline in gambling and problem gambling prevalence in North America. So some part of the decline in participation is probably part of that longer trend. There's been a reduction in lottery spending and increases in spending on casinos, sports betting, and online gambling. We did identify some significant differences between sports bettors and non-sports gamblers. So that was work that was specifically addressing a question in the sports betting legislation. No change in the prevalence of problem gambling, although problem gamblers are more likely in 2021 than in 2013 to gamble for excitement and entertainment. We noted that at-risk gamblers account for a larger proportion of gambling expenditures. And interestingly, in contrast to what we found in 2013, there were no significant differences in rates of depression, anxiety, or other mental health problems across those different groups of gamblers. And then finally, the reduction in awareness of problem gambling prevention. So the next slide is just a review of the strengths and limitations of the study. We made strenuous efforts, as you heard, to obtain high coverage and a representative sample. The response rate was lower than desired, but still acceptable to us. It was restricted to adults living in households, and we know that prevalence rates of problem gambling are much higher amongst people who do not have housing and amongst people who are incarcerated or living in group living quarters. We only interviewed in English and Spanish, so there were obviously some groups that were not included in the survey. And then probably the last major limitation is that we are limited in our causal attributions because the baseline survey and the follow-up survey were with different people. So, you know, we can't make causal attributions. In terms of future directions, we always have lots of work that we'd like to carry out, but these are the main areas where we think we can make contributions using data forward. We want to do some multivariate analyses to figure out whether problem sports betting is comorbid with problem gambling. Yes?
You're good now. You got a little muddled.
Okay. So that question right under the multivariate analyses is one of the 4 questions that's included in 23N. We want to do some work looking at the predictors of at-risk and problem gambling overall, as well as predictors of problem gambling in subgroups in the population. And then we want to see if we can replicate a very interesting finding that we had from the baseline survey, which was the importance of friends and family in contributing to people's status as recreational, at-risk, or problem gamblers. Then combining the population and the panel data, we would like to look at identifying the riskiest forms of gambling in Massachusetts, specific gambling harms, and using the panel data primarily, see if we can identify predictors of treatment seeking. And then, as I sort of tempted you a little bit in response to Commissioner Hill's question, we do have some reports on deck that will be coming at you later this year. One looking at changes in our online panels that we've been doing annually since 2022. And then we have a very large integrated report on all of the social and economic impacts that we have identified to date of casinos in Massachusetts. And so that will be coming up later this year as well. And I believe that's my last slide. And here's where you can get the reports and all of our other reports and all of the commission's other reports online. So thank you.
So commissioners, thank you, Dr. Goldberg. And you made me think of, we can't control the weather, but we can adjust the sails. So thank you for continuing on with us. Commissioners, questions? Commissioner O'Brien.
Thank you, Dr. Goldberg. Very helpful and informative as usual. A couple of takeaways for me, and we've talked about this, right? Sort of PSA campaigns. And I think back to build a life that works way back when to the, my predecessors, where they were trying to get sort of diversity in the construction and building trades and how helpful and impactful that was. And it would seem like, to Commissioner Hill's point, maybe we want to get more up-to-date information in terms of awareness, but it would seem to me an area ripe for opportunity for us, especially online, right, Mark, to sort of push some of this out. But another area that I'm really curious, Dr. Goldberg, if your upcoming research is going to dive into is that shift, that 14% that went from, recreational into at risk, who that was, what are this, how did that happen? But then also the 3% that went from problem into recreational, like what worked, what got that 3% out of that risk range into, the less risky area, and can we continue to get them moving, right? Get them off into recreational again. So I see Mark kind of leaning in as well. You guys might have some thoughts on that already, but and then my only other comment is whether we can get sort of Chinese translators, interpreters in, because I know we've had separate reports on the impact of that community, particularly the brick and mortar and what we've seen there. That would be of interest to me going forward also. But I thank you very much for the information.
So I guess in response to your first issue, Commissioner O'Brien, the multivariate analyses that we're thinking about doing will contribute somewhat to understanding what the factors were that caused movement from one category to the other, or one group of gambling to the other. But it's actually not the strongest or most reliable way to understand those kinds of transitions. And I would put a plug in here for another cohort study. I know they're very expensive, but maybe we can find a cheaper way to do them. But a cohort study where you follow the same people over a number of years to watch their transitions in and out of gambling. We have the cohort study that we conducted in Massachusetts from 2013 to 2019 that speaks very much to those kinds of transitions and what predicted those transitions. And so I would say the second thing that we would want to do after the multivariate analyses would be to revisit the MAGIC study and see if there is data there specific to your question about transitions. And then, I already made the plug for figuring out how to do a cohort study again going forward. They're invaluable in understanding,
Right.
individual trajectories. In terms of the second part of your question regarding interviewing in other languages, I've done a lot of surveys, like probably close to 100. And I have to tell you that you really have a balancing act when it comes to trying to represent the entire population of a jurisdiction like Massachusetts versus drilling down into specific communities that are very often extremely difficult to access, and extremely difficult to access in particular, to conduct surveys. And refugees and immigrants, for example, can be very, very challenging. In addition to the number of languages that they speak, they're just very suspicious about, why are you here questioning me about my behavior? And so I, over the years, have done quite a bit of work looking at how to get information from communities like that. And everything that I've learned from sort of community-based research specialists is that a standard survey works for most of the population, but it's not always the best way to get information from some of these communities. And so I'm an advocate of community-based participatory research, where basically, the people from the community do the research, and the research is brought back to them and shared with the community in ways that they can understand and actually impact. And so I think, alternate research strategies is an important way to think about, a full research agenda. It's not just a survey, but it's a survey plus.
Mhm. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think I'm thinking back to the study that we did about the Asian community and the impact, and that was discrete to supplement. So just a thought that I had too, that I'd hate to see it. You talk about who gets impacted and communities of color that get impacted most, whether I don't want to leave out a group that we've already heard from, right? The impact that they have.
And if I could just say 2 comments on that, that's the beauty of an annual and ongoing research agenda, is that we can pivot from year to year to make sure that we're responding to different needs. 1 and 2, our community-driven research line is there just for that. And whenever we get a report that comes from that line of research, it always looks different than the research like what Dr. Volberg just presented. And that's because of we're trying to address all the challenges of doing research with a community, with different communities.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Brien. I sign on also to your thoughts, and thank you for raising them. Commissioner Hill.
Dr. Volberg, I just want to say thank you. This was great information that we can now take back and digest and help us moving forward with decisions that we have to make. It was a great report. I'm still digesting a lot of it. I look at, one particular issue where people think there's too much gambling, 67%, yet 60% had been involved in some form of gaming over the last year. So even though there was a concern that there was too much, it didn't stop them from gambling. So interesting information that we saw and need to digest. And thank you for today and taking the time to come see us again. Very, very informative, and it's going to be very helpful to all of us moving forward.
Really, that's really good to hear, because Massachusetts has a special place in my heart. I wasn't born here, but my daughter grew up here and now is, a functioning adult in Greenfield, Massachusetts. But we didn't have any gambling research that I was involved with here until 2013, and it's been an incredible privilege and a real learning process for me to actually be around when the results of a study are taken into consideration. Usually I jet in and then jet back out after I present my data, and I don't hear or even see, what the process is that follows that. So it's been a real privilege to be able to lead this project, and a real privilege to have had the support of the commission for this long-lasting, world-class gambling study that I'm very proud to lead.
And if I could add one more thing, Mr. Chairman, and I'm looking forward to the information that you're going to be presenting later this year, and you've already touched upon it. Especially, when we're looking at capturing dollars that are leaving our state. In the last couple of years, and I brought this up, so I'm sorry, I'm going to bore my fellow commissioners for a second because I've already talked about this. But, very close to where I live is New Hampshire. And now that they've expanded their gaming and their gambling, I'm seeing a lot of Massachusetts residents, leaving Mass because it's so close compared to other, casinos and where they are placed here. And obviously, sports wagering, even though it's done on our phone, there are folks who are leaving the state to go and do it elsewhere. So it's going to be very interesting moving forward, the data that you present to us and the data that you're getting that's going to continue to help us do what we need to do here.
And Commissioner Hill, actually, Rachel, you didn't talk about out-of-state patronage, casinos out of state, and I thought that was a really interesting point. That it's and the baseline in 2013, 21% of respondents indicated they gambled out of state, and in 2021 that was cut in half to 10%, with most of that reduction going to Connecticut casinos.
I have to say Connecticut was not particularly happy about.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Commissioner Hill, and Dr. Volberg. Your comments really struck me. I tell people all the time, I wasn't born in Massachusetts, but I got here as soon as I could. So you know, it's good to hear that you feel the same way. You know, I'm not going to belabor the point. I think it's an opportunity, right? When I see your study, I see opportunities and opportunities for improvement, and my fellow commissioners do too. And so, you know, how can we take this data and knowledge and turn it into action? And so that's really what I'm concerned about. And I'm glad to hear that you enjoy watching us turn it into action and that you have that opportunity to do so. And a lot of that has to do with Director Vanderlinden and his team. So we appreciate them too. Anything else anybody has? I will say that Commissioner Skinner just recently had to drop off, and she apologizes for that, but she was in for most of the meeting. Do we have any commissioner updates? Any other business? Do we have a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
From Commissioner Hill, second from Commissioner O'Brien. Commissioner O'Brien.
Aye.
Commissioner Hill.
Aye.
And I am an aye. So 3-0 to adjourn. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you again,
Thank
Dr.
you.